Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. We're here to discuss the September 23rd article by Robert Kagan on the Washington Post entitled Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here. Now, besides if we just filter out the politicking and editorialization, that the central theme of the article seems to be that there is this constitutional crisis in America whereby the electoral process is fundamentally considered illegitimate if the other side wins. And Keegan is identifying Donald Trump and the Trump movement as the sort of force that's causing this, or if not causing this rift, at least bringing this rift to light. So since this was the article that you recommended, Keith, why don't we start with your thoughts on it?
Well, first, I guess I should explain a little bit about who Robert Kagan is. Robert Kagan comes from a family of neocons, the Kagans. Robert Kagan is a theorist of international relations, and he's a hyper interventionist in foreign policy. He basically has the same kind of view of international relations as someone like Bill Kristol. He's the husband of Victoria Nuland, who is in the Biden State Department and was previously in the Obama State Department, and has a very, I would say, hyper-imperialist or hyper-interventionist view of international relations as well. And he comes from a family of neocons. His brother is Frederick Kagan. His father was Donald Kagan. He's from one of these neocon family dynasties, like the Podhoritzes and Crystals and some of those characters. So this is the background this guy comes from. And what he's arguing in this op-ed piece that he had in the Washington Post, which I've always called it the voice of the CIA, because the CIA has been known for planting a lot of disinformation stories in the Washington Post, entirely with the cooperation of the editors of the Washington Post. For many years, the Washington Post was owned by Katharine Graham, who was very cooperative of these kinds of things. And in more recent times, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. So it's basically the voice of the CIA-Bezos alliance now. But in this op-ed piece, he's arguing that the United States could be on the verge of breaking up. He talks about how in 2024, the election could potentially be very contentious, particularly if Donald Trump wins again. And he's saying that whoever wins, the other side is likely to challenge the results of the election. And he's going through all the usual scenarios. He's talking about how the Republicans could allegedly stack the deck in their favor through things like voter suppression at the state level, and having their own officials appointing to the secretaries of state positions or attorney general positions in individual states where they would fail to certify an election or election results that were disfavorable to their own party. And he talks about how the federal government could lose its authority, and there could be violence and secession by states and all kinds of things. And I don't necessarily think the scenario that he is describing is certainly not impossible, and I think it's even has the potential to happen. I don't think that aspect of the article is that far-fetched, because I do see a situation where increasingly the two sides view an electoral victory by the other side is by definition illegitimate. Whenever the Republicans win an election, the Democrats seem to dismiss that as the equivalent of a fascist coup, like the Reichstag fire followed by Hitler's appointment to the chancellery and the Enabling Act. They see it on that level, and they always assume that couldn't happen unless the other side cheated. And then I see that coming from a lot of the Republican side as well. Whenever the Democrats win, they think, well, it's because they stuffed the ballot box with the votes of dead people, or the president really isn't a U.S. citizen, like the birther thing with Obama and all that. So it works both ways. But I think that the big point is that for any kind of electoral system to actually work, there does have to be some agreement among the general public as to the rules of the game. Whenever the losing side loses an election, they have to be willing to lose gracefully, or at least accept the results on the grounds that they will get another chance in a few years. And increasingly, I see the rhetoric coming from both sides, as well as the actions coming from both sides that indicate that both sides are increasingly unwilling to do that. The Democrats think that the Republicans think if the Democrats win, it's the equivalent of the 1917 storming of the Winter Palace, and the Democrats, if the Republicans win, they think it's the Reichstag and the Hitler's appointment to the chancellery all over again. So I do see the possibility for instability or some kind of constitutional crisis. Now, the problem I have with Kagan's article is that it's very one-sided. He basically puts it all on the Trump people. He says, well, the Republicans are trying to cheat, and Donald Trump is trying to stage a coup against democracy, and he's a strong man, aspiring fascist dictator, with there's no self-reflection from the other side at all, in terms of because this is clearly a two-way street. I mean, for example, the whole time that Donald Trump was president, the MSNBC and other liberal media outlets claimed the whole time that he was a Russian puppet. It's with no evidence whatsoever. They spent years pushing this line, and then it totally flubbed. So while I disagree with the way that Kagan frames the argument, I do think that his basic point has some validity to it.
Okay, Swithun Dobson.
To get the sort of fluff out of the way, just to carry on from what Keith was saying, Kagan has a laughable lack of self-awareness in the entire article, and his complete Trump derangement syndrome is just like, he should be certified for it. I mean, it is just insane. The founders could envision a Caesar figure, but not Donald Trump. Make of that one. So whether there could be a constitutional crisis and either side don't accept the result, I think that could increasingly be the case. It would be, but what seems to matter, I think, it could well go through the courts many times, but I think we're still probably a reasonable distance away from when the final court decision comes up, that the other side doesn't just relent and give up to some extent. They will acquiesce, but carry on claiming it was illegitimate whilst at the same time accepting it. So, in certain respects, the Democrats from Trump in 2016, they just, he won. No, but he didn't really because of the Russians, but we're not going to completely unseat him overtly. Similarly, with the Trump supporters going, no, Biden rigged the election. We're going to have all this ballot checks in like Arizona and had all the dead votes, etc. So I think you could have that. I mean, as to whether we're going to be in a situation relatively soon where it doesn't matter even what the courts say and either side doesn't acquiesce, that I think is possibly a bit further away. Also, what I think is more important is whether or not people with actual political and sort of economic clout actually will accept the result. It doesn't matter if the Trumpkins don't accept it on the back of their trailers in the Bible Belt. Nobody particularly cares because they have no influence. But if it was the case that, for instance, the Brahmins of the universities and the upper middle class, if they decide, no, but this result is illegitimate and we are not going to accept any orders and just sort of basically ignore a Republican leader, then you're going to have much more of an issue. I mean, just to elaborate on that, it seems to be the case that most anti-lockdown support was from people with absolutely no political or economic clout whatsoever. Anybody who was basically part of the ruling class or relatively close to the state apparatus with respect to their income or their status were basically entirely on board, which is why nothing has really been done against it. I mean, particularly the obvious case there is Australia at present, which is basically still, well, I mean, was it DeSantis was basically saying it had less freedom than China, which is probably true at present. So that's what matters. So I think you're going to get a constitutional crisis if it is the case that people like relatively high-ranking generals in the military, the finance, the industrialists, and the intelligentsia of the upper universities and the media, etc. And they go so far as to go, no, this is entirely illegitimate. We just simply will not follow the orders that you give. Then we're going to have a constitutional crisis. I don't know how close that is. At present, it seems to be the partisans on the ground, and those higher up will tend to just make an agreement at the moment. But I think you're going to have it filter up to there for anything meaningful to take place. Until that happens, it's just going to be saber rattling. That would be my general perspective at present.
Okay, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, with Robert Kagan's article, it's very interesting to see many of these neocons in high places placing their faith, or at least some of their faith, in the Democratic Party to weed out future Trump-like candidates. He does state in his article that, the Biden administration is not without its problems. But I think, taking a step back and sort of absorbing that article, I think with Trump around, the neocons don't really have a future in the Republican Party. The neocons just have too many international goals to be allies in a Trump-led Republican Party. And, with people like, Richard Pearl, who I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, who I believe authored the papers that stipulated the countries targeted for U.S. invasion, like Iraq, Iran, Libya, and so on and so forth. I think Syria was part of it as well. These goals are just, there's no way that these high and internationalist goals have anything to be related to by, average American rural voters or suburban voters, or even urban voters for that matter. I think it's an interesting question as to whether or not the U.S. is headed for a constitutional crisis. I definitely agree with Keith that, the overall, the possibility of us heading towards that is not far-fetched, or at least we could see some more intensified versions of what had occurred in the summer of 2020. One important point that I believe deserves some attention, and this is something that a friend and popular guest of the show, Right Ruminations, has been consistent on throughout his own videos, as well as his videos on Todd's channel, is that things are not truly bad just yet. Now, by which I mean, things are not bad yet to the point where you have, say, thousands of militiamen descending into places like Portland or Baltimore to liberate those places of perceived leftist takeover or anarchy, thereby setting off, bloody gun battles with Antifa and other left-wing activist elements on the ground. Now, of course, this has happened, but in smaller, much more isolated circumstances, similar to the situation with Kyle Rittenhouse and so on. Now, to be sure, yes, things are certainly tense and very uneasy, but we're not quite on the cusp of a new widespread bloody conflict. And you have to remember that the majority of the American public is neither committed to the left or to the right in a really hardcore sense. Most working class people are fairly apolitical, with maybe a few firmly held political opinions. But, in modern times, it takes an enormous amount of political pressure and economic destabilization to mobilize people into this, on the ground activism, rioting, and so forth. We are headed in that direction in many ways, but it's important to be honest and sober on this point, because I think many people seem to enjoy some of the sensational aspects of a second civil war, or the possibility of a second civil war. I think I'll leave my initial comments at that.
Yeah, so a few things that I noticed about the article that I just thought were not fluff, but I thought just ridiculous, is he talks about in one of the top paragraphs, most Trump supporters are good parents, good neighbors, and solid members of their communities. Their bigotry, for the most part, is typical white American bigotry, perhaps with an added measure of resentment and less filtered mode of expression since Trump arrived on the scene. But these are normal people in the sense that they think and act as people have for centuries. They put their trust in family, tribe, and religion and race. Although zealous in defense of their own rights and freedoms, they are less concerned about the rights and freedoms of those who are not like them. This is not unusual. What is unusual is to value the rights of others who are unlike you as much as you value your own. Now, of course, this is complete bollocks. Who actually defends the rights of the white working class? Nobody. So it's like, whatever the value of that statement is in some sort of objective, moral, deontological sense, his side sure as hell doesn't do that. And he knows it full well. And he goes into this little spiel about Republican virtue. As it happens, however, that is what the American experiment in Republican democracy requires. It is what the framers meant by Republican virtue, a love of freedom not only for oneself, but also an abstract universal good, a love of self-government as an ideal, a commitment to abide by the laws passed by the legitimate democratic process, and a healthy fear of and vigilance against tyranny of every kind. Well, here's the problem. You can't have any normative moral claims when the left and the Democratic Party have been pushing nominalism, nihilism, deconstructionism for the last 60 years. I mean, where is this going to come from? And furthermore, you can't invoke Madison and then ignore the most important thing. If you were to ask Madison or Benjamin Franklin or John Adams, what was a prerequisite for the Constitution to function? A moral and religious people. In fact, that is exactly what George Washington said in his farewell address. Would anybody consider the Rainbow Fag Coalition of the left moral and religious? No. I mean, he obviously doesn't mean what he's saying, because any sort of appeal to the founding fathers and democratic consensus assumes a lot that is not at all true today, and certainly not at all true with the Democrats. Now, a lot of what he's saying seems to be a riff on the same kind of idea we found in the Muckraker book, It Can't Happen Here, written by Sinclair Lewis in 1936, which sort of was saying that there's this populist candidate who could be a new Hitler. Back in the day, it was supposed to be Huey Long, though Huey Long, I think, died that year, 1936. He was assassinated. But this is an old idea. It's kind of like this wet dream of the left that they'll have their, stand against Hitlerism in America. And, back in 1936, it was Huey Long, and now it's Donald Trump. I mean, that's just how the cycle goes. The other thing that's interesting, too, is this whole concern about how, Trump in general has degraded the political commentary of the nation. How we have this sort of mudslinging political discourse. But really, if we look at the decline in American discourse of politics, let's say the 1960 election when we had, JFK versus Nixon, that was a fairly civil presidential campaign where both sides made arguments in favor of their position without getting too personal. What we see, though, is this sort of low blow politics begins with the left. It starts with William F. Buckley Jr.'s debate with Gore Vidal, where Gore Vidal never actually had any points to make. He was constantly trying to get a rise out of Buckley, calling him a Nazi so that Buckley would freak out on national television, which Buckley did do. But the whole point was, it wasn't to make a political point. It wasn't to have an argument, to have a policy. It was to humiliate Buckley by causing him to lose his cool and discrediting the leading conservative thinker of the day. And that's been the MO of the Democrats since the mid-'60s. And now that the Republicans are fighting dirty as well, they cry foul. Now, whether we could talk about, again, from a deontological moral stance, should the Republicans stoop to that level, that's another question. The fact is the Democrats for the last 60 years have been doing this publicly, and they've provoked this response. In a lot of ways, this is a response that the Democrats themselves have provoked. Whether you like Trump or not, we wouldn't have Trump without Obama. We wouldn't have Trump without the Clintons. We wouldn't have Trump without Carter. It's this democratic process of, for lack of a better word, screwing over middle America, especially as perceived in the Rust Belt and the Deep South, that they're like, well, who else can we turn to? The blue dogs who used to be solid Democrat voters, except when they voted for Reagan, flipped to Trump in 2016 because it was pretty clear that Hillary was part of the globalist agenda to ship their jobs overseas. And so even if you look at some of the more interesting points Kagan's making, they're either made completely in bad faith, completely out of the context in which the founding fathers. I mean, why would you even invoke the founding fathers as someone who's a Democrat in the first place? I mean, they're just white slave owners that you're trying to tear down their statues. Like, what? I mean, where's Kagan been? Like last year, they were tearing down statues of all the founding fathers. It's like, it feels like he's just in this weird limbo where he uses like Republican light talking points, I guess, to like not scare the centrists, but then he's teaming up with like far left radicals. It's really just a bizarre situation to be in. It's, and again, if we look at, say, what he wants to make this, 1930s Germany, it would be like as if a conservative supported the communists, in the street fights, which that's inconceivable. I mean, that's why the conservatives, quote unquote, supported Hitler, because they thought him as a less of a threat than the communists in the street. But this idea that Republican virtue and that we care about, the rights of the other, the sort of, Voltairean statement, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. The left has never believed that, like ever, in the United States. It's never defended the rights of free speech of conservatives or religious people. I mean, tell that to the people at Waco who, were destroyed by the federal government, and the left cheered them on, and that happened. So, there's no principle involved here at all. And I think that even if we take it on a more intellectual level, it's just a complete flop of an argument. Keith, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot of different aspects to this. When I was reading the Kagan article, I was thinking, well, who is this guy in Antifa? Because it's he's like I joked, I think, on Facebook or Twitter or somewhere recently that the neocons are what you would get if the Antifa had billionaire donors, because it's the same kind of rhetoric. I mean, I remember thinking, well, take out some of this pseudo patriotic stuff, like the stuff you were talking about, James Madison or whatever. Take that stuff out of it, and it's basically just Antifa rhetoric. This could be from some Antifa, manifesto or YouTube channel or something like that. Of course, one of the longstanding sources of the conflict between the paleoconservatives and the neoconservatives is that the neoconservatives really take seriously or pretend to take seriously this whole idea that the United States is a creedal nation, that to be an American, you really just have to affirm the founding documents, the Constitution and Declaration of Independence and all of that kind of stuff, like the 39 Articles of Faith of the Church of England or something. And beyond that, it doesn't really matter. Nothing else really matters. The paleocons, of course, have the view, well, no, the American founders were culturally specific. They were basically British Protestants, so theoretically somebody else could have the same philosophy, but it's rooted in British Protestantism, which I think is historically accurate. I mean, because Benjamin Franklin thought Germans probably couldn't be Americans, which is interesting because German Americans are actually the largest white ethnicity in the United States today. But Benjamin Franklin thought that Germans couldn't be Americans. So you can only imagine what he would think of the open borders idea that you see today. In fact, a lot of the paleocons, I've been following the paleocon versus neocon rivalry for years, and one of the big criticisms that the paleocons have of the neocons is they have this, creedal nation doctrine, and I would go even further though in this. It's always seemed to me that the whole creedal nation doctrine that the neocons have is very cynical. It's just a calculated propagandistic tool, because I don't think they really believe it. I think they're basically Trotskyites at heart, because that's what their movement is rooted in philosophically, and they seem to have the same kind of views that Trotskyites and others that preceded them, like Jacobins, have, which is the idea that there's this global, we need to liberate mankind through spreading the revolution to the ends of the earth and that kind of stuff. It's permanent revolution and all of that. And neocons seem to have that same kind of mentality. They just want to use American military power to do it, as opposed to, say, third world insurgents or something like that, like some of the furthest left sectors would be into. And I think it's and as you were saying, Todd, the one-sidedness of it is interesting. Now there are some commentators that have a somewhat similar outlook who have a more nuanced view. Like, I know I saw an interview recently with Amy Chua, who was a professor of something or other, law, I think it is, at Yale. she's known as the Tiger Mom. That's what she's famous for, but that's not what this was about. She's actually the daughter of ethnic Chinese immigrants from the Philippines. Like, so her ancestry is that of being a minority ethnic Chinese in the Philippines. And she has an interesting take on some of these kinds of issues. And she says that she likes to use the analogy of the historical plight of the despised middleman minority, because the ethnic Chinese are like that throughout the Southeast Asia. They're kind of like they on one hand, they tend to be fairly successful and prosperous. They're influential in the professions and the merchant class and all of that kind of stuff. And they're disliked for this. I mean, if you talk to anybody from, say, the Southeast Asia or even Latin America or the Caribbean, they'll have less than pleasant things to say about the Chinese, unless they are Chinese. But Amy Chua comes from this kind of background, and she was saying that basically the situation that we have in this country is that the coastal elites have become kind of like the equivalent of the middleman minority, in the sense that, yeah, they are a minority, but they're culturally dominant, and they're insistent upon imposing their own ways on everybody else, and there's a lot of economic exploitation involved in that as well. And she was saying that, if anything, you could compare Trumpism, at least, to some of the movements of the left that you've seen in Latin America in recent years, where it's more about people on the bottom layer of the socioeconomic level in revolt against the kind of traditional elites and that kind of stuff. Now, the comeback to that is always, yeah, but if you look at the Trump's vote totals, you'll see that Trump voters have higher than average income and that kind of stuff. And whenever that argument is raised, I always say, yeah, that's true of Republican voters on a more general level. If you just want to generalize, every single person who votes Republican, it's still probably the case that people with higher than average incomes are more likely to vote Republican. But when you look at Trump's hardcore followers, it's not really that. They tend to come from either the, I guess what you could call what Sam Francis called the post-bourgeois proletariat, that is, the working to middle classes that are experiencing a state of decline, or they come from the kind of the lower bourgeois sectors that are losing power to this rising tech oligarchs and professional managerial class and all of that, or they come from people who've been completely lumpenized. Like if you look at some of the really hardcore Trump people, like some of the rioters at January 6th, like the Camp Auschwitz guys. I mean, these are lumpen people. These are not bourgeois people at all. So I think that's kind of the kind of framework I would put this in terms of context. And another analogy might be to what's going on in France. Like if you look at where the National Front, well now it's called the National Rally, but the Le Penist party in France, if you look at where the bulk of their voting base comes from, well, not just the bulk of it, but if you look at the districts where they do the best, it's usually the former communist districts. And for the same kind of reasons, it's because they're considered the party now of the working class, because they're the ones that are going to defend working class employment interests and that kind of stuff against neoliberalism. Kagan is just completely unaware of any of this, or probably doesn't care about any of this. But he's just regurgitating this line. Like it's always been this joke for the neocons. It's always 1939 because there's always some Hitler on the horizon, whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Putin or whomever. But now they're applying it domestically as well. It's always 19. There was actually an article in the National Catholic Reporter, which is like a liberal Catholic publication, about in response to Kagan's article, a favorable response. But they were saying, yeah, it's 1932 in America now. We're on the verge of the Nazi coup or whatever. So yeah, it's an interesting to dissect where some of these people are coming from.
All right, Swithun.
Just to take a slightly different tact with respect to Kagan. Kagan goes on and on and on about how the electoral system is legitimized and that neither side will accept the result, whilst at the same time doubling down on all the left's support for postal voting, same day of registration, etc., and seems to have absolutely no interest whatsoever in trying to increase the reputation of the electoral system in America whatsoever. So his use of the founding fathers seems incredibly cynical. As clearly in a similar point, his defense of the electoral system in general. His claim that, we need a unity government headed by Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse among some of the liberal Democrats to increase the trust into American institutions to try and keep the republic together. And it's like, as Todd has said, that seems unlikely. And then he just doubles down on the implication that somehow the American electoral system is completely above board. Now, anybody with any sense of fair-mindedness would realize that is simply untrue. I mean, the allegations of and substantive allegations of voter fraud and things go back at least to, if I remember correctly, the Nixon-Kennedy election. I can't remember the precise details of that, but that seems to be at least not in just unfounded speculation that Nixon may have lost at least some votes there, or Kennedy got more. I can't remember which way around it was, but has absolutely zero intention of doing it. As Keith's point was about, they care about liberal internationalism and abstract idealism. It just seems to a completely cynical power play, because if it wasn't cynical, he would at least recognize, well, even if he thought that saying their registration was fine, and postal ballots are absolutely fine, he would at least try to allay the fears of the opposition to go, oh no, I understand you have these objections to this thing, but no. Well, if you look at this way, how it's actually run. Actually, it's quite difficult, to vote early and vote often. It's actually quite difficult, to influence people by postal votes. But he simply doesn't do that at all. It's just an entirely cynical piece to rabble rouse the Washington Post readers into thinking that, oh no, we must save the electoral system as it is. We must just save it, because it is going to be destroyed by these evil Machiavellian figures. And that's the entire purpose of the article. So it's just the lack of self-awareness. I mean, maybe it's self-awareness. It's just hugely cynical. And as Todd has pointed out, this has been this is interesting. The play from the left is the left when you had sort of broadly conservative Christian culture were very much about cultural relativism and moral relativism, except now when they're in a bit more of a cultural ascendancy, are now moral absolutists that everyone must bow at the trans flag and must walk across the rainbow zebra crossing. I don't know if you have zebra crossings in America, but that is what you must do. And now they are very clearly sort of moral absolutists. So again, it's just a case of, well, they're just using whatever tactics work and not intending to be consistent in any way, shape, or form. So that was one of the things that really stood out to me from the Kagan article.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, it's very curious to see Kagan utilize this shtick of white bigotry as if we're trapped in 1950. I really wonder if the neocons can tell they're on their way out of U.S. politics, and these frustrations that Kagan has with figures like Trump are a sign of the neocons and some sort of they're in their death throes or something like that. I believe that when Trump fired John Bolton, Kagan was one of these neocons that sort of bitched and moaned that this was Trump mortally wounding his own administration or some such nonsense. This article is either an indication of some kind of long-term, brilliant political pincer move as a way of somehow recapturing and molding the Republican Party in the image of Reagan that includes somehow like gays and, trans people and also centrists at the same time, or this is just indecisive, pseudo-woke ramblings of someone who was, I don't know, never a true Republican to begin with, and is upset that we haven't carpet bombed Tehran just yet or something like that. This is almost like kind of a normie tier thing to mention, but he doesn't seem to take into account all of the gains that the left has made in the last 30 years or so. I think, by which I mean things like, the left making gains in places like public education and turning the suburbs more blue, and the takeover of the modern HR department, the almost complete domination of the universities, specifically the humanities, entertainment, Hollywood. I mean, things like cartoons. I mean, everyday commercials having subtle woke vibes. The list goes on. And it should really come to no surprise, or at least to Kagan, it might seem this way, that, that there would be some kind of societal reaction to all of this, whether, it'd be justified or not. America being slowly transformed from a traditional Christian republic to this consumerist, woke capitalist society is going to come with some serious consequences, or at least reactions. And so it's certainly naive for many on the left to be surprised or upset that there's these rejections of these various changes. And Trump himself is a big variable in all this. I think that people forget that, at this stage in American history, and this is one thing that I was kind of waiting for Kagan to bring up, but I didn't really see it throughout the article, is that the corruption and red tape bureaucracy of the political establishment created such blunders as the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and driving the national debt to these mythical levels, and many other things. All of these things, the political establishment, I think, since post-World War II, created the demand for someone like Donald Trump. The people who voted for Trump didn't necessarily vote for him because of who he was, but it was because of who he wasn't. The election of Donald Trump, among many things, was a societal repudiation of woke politics, and it was also a repudiation of this sort of Obama, like, used car salesman brand of politicking. There was, I don't know, there was no way that that brand of politician was going to be able to have, a long-term future in America without, creating such blunders in Iraq and Afghanistan, and again, expensive social spending, things like that. And of course, something like that is going to create the demand for Donald Trump. Again, I realize that's almost kind of like a normie tier talking point, but that's one of the big elephants in the room that Kagan seemed to fail to address. And I think that's one thing that many people fail to address. I mean, and I think that's even a point that that Yang made during his candidacy, that the system created demand for someone like Donald Trump, and people didn't know how to react to that initially, especially on the left. So yeah, it's tough to tell where the neocons are headed, or what state the neocons are in, and I think they're having some either some identity issues, or they don't know what to do long term, because someone like Trump, regardless if you love him or hate him or are indecisive about him, he doesn't play nicely with the neocons. And the neocons have been nothing but trouble, and especially on the foreign stage. And so I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, just a few points about the founders again. This sort of idea that the neocons have been pushing, that the founding fathers were sort of like advocating this radical individualist cosmopolitan consumerism, which has been pushed recently by, say, Prager University, is just patently absurd. I really think George Washington's farewell address is just really helpful here. For this, you have every inducement of sympathy and interest, citizens by birth or choice of a common country. That country has a right to consecrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in a national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from the local discriminations. With slight shades of differences, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. The same. Interesting. Of all the dispositions and habits which will lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain Would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizen? The mere political equality with pious men ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with the private and public felicity. Let it simply be added, where it is security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in our courts. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. And checkmate, new atheists. The founding fathers weren't new atheists. Whatever may be concealed to the influence of refined education on manners of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail on the exclusion of religious principle. And then when it comes to debt and money, Ben Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac says this: the day comes round before you are aware, and the demand is made before you are prepared to satisfy it. Or if you bear your debt in mind, the term which at first seems so long will, as it lessens, appear extremely short. Time will seem to have added wings to his heels as well as shoulders. Those have a short Lent, saith Poor Richard, who owe money to be paid at Easter. Then, since, as he says, the borrower is a slave to the lender and the debtor to the creditor, disdain the chain, preserve your freedom, and maintain your independency by industrious and free. Be frugal and free. At present, perhaps, you may think yourself in thriving circumstances, and that you can bear a little extravagance without injury. But for age and want, save while you may. No morning sun lasts a whole day, as Poor Richard says. And so, I mean, there is this like almost like cottage industry of like phony founding fathers that are like completely opposite of what the historical writings of these men are. And I think the problem with this sort of faux founding father appeal, but more broadly, the claims made by Kagan himself are that this sort of like media space we live in is a part of what Jean Baudrillard calls the simulacrum, which is essentially this. It's not even a virtual world. It's a world that exists that is completely distinct from reality, makes no appeal to reality, and in fact resents reality as a threat to its own existence. And the problem with living in the simulacra is that there's no way to derive cause and effect because there's no fixed points, so there's no inference possibility of cause and effect because none of it's real. And of course, Kagan is existing in this world, which is why Kagan can indulge in all these fantasies about a fascist takeover in Trump, and why the founding fathers can be whatever you want them to be, because we're not living in the real world. We're living in the simulacrum. And this is the problem with modern politics in general. We can't trust who says what. We have a hard time even determining cause and effect because the sources that are giving us the information are all heavily mediated by digital content, and then the person who's filming and editing that digital content. So it's multiple levels of mediation such that the actual truth gets lost. Now, this is not an inscrutable problem, but it does make it much more difficult to solve. And I think that if we look at, the context in which Kegan is in, this is sort of why works like his are so prevalent, but also so confusing. So we're nearing the end of the hour. So I'll start with you, Keith. What would be your final statements?
Yeah, one thing that Terminal Philosophy raised earlier, one point that I thought was interesting was Trump's actual relationship to the neocons. The thing that I like about Trump more than anything else is that, I'm not a Trumpist. I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't vote for anybody, but the thing that I like about Trump more than anything else is the fact that he really has pushed the neocons to the side. When he entered the election in 2015 in the primaries, he started knocking these guys out one by one: Rubio, Jeb Bush, all these other characters. Now, he's made more concessions to them than I would have liked. He did accept Elliot Abrams into his administration as the envoy to Iran. He had Bolton in for a while, but then came to his senses and fired him. And I think that that's the real issue with Kagan. I think Kagan doesn't like the fact that Trump is mean to his friends, as well he should be, as well as Trump should be, disowning these guys. And I think in that sense, what Trump, I think, is, I mentioned the analogy to the national rally in France a moment ago. I think in some ways Trump serves a similar role in American politics, in the sense that what he's done in the Republican Party is create something similar to the national rally, where it's sort of this family fiefdom that's a type of permanent right-wing populist opposition party that's not going to ever achieve full state power, but it is there as a thorn in the side to the kind of neoliberal establishment. And the effect that that's had on the Republican Party is now all these other factions are just another interest group within the Republican Party. They have to share space with all of these Trumpist people. But to my mind, and this is a point that usually gets missed, but to my mind, Trump is a liberal. I mean, I would argue that he's one of the most liberal presidents America ever had, with the exception of maybe Obama and possibly Jimmy Carter. If you look at what Trump had, I mean, he often governed like a normal Republican. I mean, he turned over a lot of things to the regular Republican apparatus because he didn't really seem to have that much interest in governing, which is, unusual for someone who's supposed to be a fascist. But, he seemed to be more just about, getting his name in the paper and, you guys can just run the government and do what you want. But if you look at what Trump has actually done, okay, when he was running for office the first time around in 2016 at campaign rallies, you would see pictures of him waving a rainbow flag. I mean, did Nixon do that? Did Ronald Reagan do that? Trump's wife is an ex-Playboy model. I mean, can you imagine if that had been the case among a presidential candidate, say in the 1970s or 1980s? He's been married 3 times. I mean, the guy is a standard, New York liberal. I mean, in terms of lifestyle, he has more in common with somebody like, say, Hugh Hefner than, say, Reverend Jerry Falwell. Well, I don't know about Jerry Falwell Jr. seems to have a lot in common with him. But the kind of, socially conservative, religiously conservative milieu. I mean, he actually, he's popular among that milieu electorally, but he has nothing in common with them culturally. So, Trump is if nothing else, not a liberal. And if you look at his actual electoral base, he's actually increased the vote totals of minorities, gays, Muslims, all of these Democratic Party constituent groups. He's actually increased the vote total for the Republican Party from that particular milieu. So if anything, he's moved the Republican Party leftward, not rightward. He hasn't moved the Republicans towards fascism. He's actually made the Republican Party more liberal in many ways. And the arguments that someone like Fred Kagan or Robert Kagan is making seem to be, as Tom was pointing out, they're completely bad faith arguments. It's almost something like he's just made it up to make it look like, oh, we've got this bad guy looming on the horizon, this wannabe fascist dictator. And I think that the real issue is that Trump has just thrown a wrench in a lot of their plans. It's kept them from dominating the Republican Party the way that they want. He never gave them their war with Iran like they wanted, and I think that's the real grievance they have. Although I do think Kagan's wider point about a possible American fracturing is valid. I saw a survey just yesterday that was a poll conducted by the University of Virginia, that showed that 51% of Trump voters indicated they would be fine with the blue states seceding and becoming their own country, and 40% of Biden voters said that about the red states. And I've never seen the percentages that high. I mean, that's higher than what it was just a few months ago, because I follow these polls, and and the sympathy for that kind of thing, that kind of break up the United States kind of idea, has increased dramatically in the last year or so. I mean, it's gone way up from what it was, say, 15 years ago, and then up until about 7 years ago, it was something like 25%. Then it shot up past the 30%. Now it's up past the 40% on average. So it does show the wider society does continue to polarize.
All right, Swithun.
Moving on from the Trump comments of Keith, it would be interesting to see if Trump were to run in 2024, my date's right, and win, whether or not, or how he would treat the neocons then. Would he even have any in his department, in his administration at all? That would be interesting to see if that was to take place. Because he did seem to get fed up, especially with Bolton, etc. Or maybe he would keep them in because, well, they're part of the donor class and they keep a certain country happy. So they may have to remain for that reason. But to go back to my initial point, I think a secession, even though the numbers are in favor of it are higher amongst the Republican supporters than the Democrat supporters, I think it's only really the mainstay of the Democratic supporting base who actually have the cultural weight to actually pull it off. Because if you look at all the major institutions, the industrialists, etc., they are all basically Democrat. Well, no, not all of them, but certainly the new technocracy are the media class, etc., and university types. And again, those are the ones who have the most cultural weight, and those are the ones who would probably go through with it more than the Republican base. Talking about Republican virtues, etc., in a more generic sense, it would seem to me that the quote unquote the right in America and the Republican Party and support base in general is much more in favor of the idea of the United States, and going to do it for the country, whereas the Democrats more so have been in the case of their own interest groups more than anything else. Now, that may be unfair, and that may not be true in all cases, but that's my general perception. And so if anybody is really going to be able to pull off any sort of, at the moment that is, any sort of secessionary movement or genuine opposition to an electoral victory, so again in sort of Kagan's dystopian future in which Trump wins by a landslide in 2024 because he's stuffed all the ballot boxes, I think that is a much more likely that's a much more likely scenario for a constitutional crisis than if the Democrats win, just because of the relative cultural weight that the important supporters have. So yeah, if Trump does win in 2024, it's much more likely, I think, than if, say, I have no idea who the Democrats will raise from the dead to put for a candidate in 2024, but we will see.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I would have to agree with Keith and his assessment of Donald Trump's rejection of the neocons. Although it was disappointing that Trump kept Pompeo throughout his administration, I didn't vote for Trump either. I didn't vote for anyone, just like Keith in the last election. I think it's absolutely true to say that Donald Trump is by far the most liberal Republican that has ever occupied the executive branch. I mean, again, all these pictures of him waving the gay pride flag and stories of him storming the dressing rooms of beauty pageant contestants and having a former, Playboy, or like a playmate or whatever they're called as his wife. Yeah, I mean, and he's from this big business Democrat New York atmosphere. I mean, he's been a Democrat, I think, for most of his life anyways. So yeah, he's certainly the most liberal Republican that's ever taken office. As for Kagan's article, there's certainly a good possibility of some type of constitutional crisis in the future, but I don't think that will be solely because of Trump's presence in U.S. politics. I think the possibility of that crisis really derives from cultural reasons of the cultural war in the United States. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, all I can say is that Kagan's echoes very loudly. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks everybody for participating. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.